myself, but then I want to see all of you. So give me a thumbs up if you can only see, if you see me as a spotlight or you see the gallery. Thumbs up. Okay, good. Okay, great. We're going to get started. In 1 second. I got to get my prop. Okay. Hello. Here we are. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Zuckerman, the author of the Book of Jeremiah. Welcome to the January Literary Modiin author event. This is our 20th event, so I'm very excited about that. So thank you to all of you who've been to many of the events. But for those of you who are new, I'll just say 2 words before we get started. For those of you who don't even know where Modiin is, it's the planned city in Israel, halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And we're right near the airport, and the airport just reopened to tourists if you're vaccinated, so come visit. In Modiin, we have a large population of English speakers. And so in June 2019, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers we have here. We had several in-person events, and then when the pandemic hit, we switched to virtual format, which allows us to hear from authors and welcome all of you from all over the world. So, as I said, very excited for our 20th event today. We have a bunch of people on the call who have been previously featured at Literary Modiin. So I'm going to share my screen for 1 second, and you can see the just the list of the books of authors we've had. And tomorrow I'll be sending around a link with sending around an email with the recording of tonight, as well as links to where you can buy the books for tonight's authors, and also this list, so you can take a look and see who else we've hosted. And I encourage you to check out all of these books here. We've had a great lineup, many award winners, so that's great. Okay. The format of tonight's event is that each author will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have the large attendance today, so everyone's on mute, and you can put your questions in the chat box. And any technical difficulties, just send me a private note in the chat as well. So if you are on Facebook and want to start a watch party, we're broadcasting this in Literary Modiin, so feel free. Okay. So enough about that. Now I'd like to introduce our first author. Julie Orringer is the author of 2 award-winning books, The Invisible Bridge, a New York Times bestselling novel, and How to Breathe Underwater, a collection of stories. Her novel, The Flight Portfolio, tells the story of Varian Fry, the New York journalist who went to Marseille in 1940 to save writers and artists blacklisted by the Gestapo. All of her work has been published by Alfred A. Knopf, and her books have been translated into 20 languages. She is the winner of the Paris Review's Plimpton Prize and has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Coleman Center at the New York Public Library, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, the MacDowell Colony, and Yaddo. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and children and is at work on a novel set in New Orleans. So let me spotlight her. Where'd you go? Julie. Hold on. Oh, there you are. Okay, sorry. Play spotlight, and let me unmute you. There we go. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me? Well, thanks so much for having me, Julie. It's so much fun to be able to participate in this event from all the way over here in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm so glad to be here and so excited to hear all of you talk about your work. So I think I might begin with a little bit of reading, since Julie gave you a tiny bit about what the book is about. And then I'll talk a little bit about my research process and how this novel came to be, and also about what's happening to it now, because there are a couple of exciting things on the horizon. So I'm going to just read to you from the first chapter of this novel, The Flight Portfolio. And the first chapter is named for a place in France called Gordes, Gordes. There was, as it turned out, no train to the village where the Chagalls lived, one of many complications he'd failed to anticipate. He had to pay a boy with a motorbike to run him up from the station at Cavaillon, 10 miles at a brain-shaking pace along a narrow, rutted road. On either side rose ochre hills, striated with grapevines and lavender and olive trees. Overhead, a blinding white-veined sky. The smell was of the boy's leather jacket and of charred potatoes, exhalate of his clever homemade fuel. At the foot of the village, the boy parked in a shadow, accepted Varian's francs, and tore off into the distance before Varian could arrange a ride back. The streets of Gordes, carved into a sun-struck limestone hill above the Luberon Valley, offered little in the way of shade. He would have given anything to be back in Marseille with a glass of Éperol before him, watching sailors and girls, gangsters and spice vendors parading the Canebière. The Chagalls had only agreed to see him on the basis that he not bring up the prospect of their emigration. But what other subject was there? The Nazis had taken Paris months ago. They were burning books in the streets of Alsace. They could send any refugee over the border at will. At least the Chagalls had agreed. That was something. But as he reached their house, an ancient Catholic girls' school on the Rue de la Fontaine Basse, he found himself fighting the urge to flee. His credentials, if anyone examined them, amounted to a fanatic's knowledge of European history, a desire to get out from behind his desk in New York, and a deep frustration with his isolationist nation. And yet this was his job. He'd volunteered for it. What was more, he believed he could do it. He raised his hand and knocked. An eye appeared in the brass circlet of the peephole, and a girl in a striped apron opened the door. She listened, strangling her index finger with one dark curl, as he stated his name and mission. Then she ushered him down a corridor and out into a courtyard, where a stone path led to a triangle of shade. There, at a bare wooden table, Chagall and his wife sat at lunch, the painter in his smock, his hair swept back from his forehead in silver waves, Bella in a close-fitting black dress too hot for the day. "Ah, Monsieur Fry," Chagall said, rising to meet him. The painter's eyes were large and uncommonly sharp, his expression one of bemusement. "You've come, after all. I thought you might. You won't forget our agreement, will you?" "All I want is your company for an hour." "You're lying, of course. But you lie charmingly." They sat together at the table, Bella on Varian's left, the painter to his right, he, Varian Fry, sitting down with the Chagalls, with Chagall, author of those color-saturated visions, those buoyant bridal couples and intelligent-eyed goats he'd seen in hushed rooms at the Museum of Modern Art. Bella filled a plate with brown, hard-crusted miche, soft cheese, sardines crackling with salt. She handed it across the table, assessing Varian in silence. "Had you been here a few days ago, we would have had tomatoes," Chagall said. "A farmer brings them up to the market on Thursdays. I'm sorry we don't have more to offer. The bread's a little hard on the tooth, I'm afraid. But c'est la guerre." "This is lavish," Varian said. "You're too kind." "Not at all. We like to share what we have." He gestured around him at the bare yellow stones, the rough benches, the shock of gold-green hillside visible through an archway in the wall. "As you see, we're living a quiet and retired life in our little dacha. No one will bother us here at Gordes." "You have a studio," Varian said. "You're still producing work. That's what makes you dangerous." "Our daughter says the same," Bella said. "She's been saying it for months. But you understand, Monsieur Fry, my husband's reputation will protect him. Vichy wouldn't dare touch us." "With respect, Madame Chagall, I don't believe that for a moment. Vichy is subject to the Nazis' whims, and we all know what they're capable of. I've seen it myself. I was in Berlin in '35, sent by the magazine I worked for. My last night in town there was a riot on the Kurfürstendamm. The things I saw, men pulled from their shops and beaten in the streets, an old man stabbed through the hand at a cafe table, boys dragging a woman by her hair." "These things happened in Germany," Chagall said, his tone harder now. "They won't happen here, not to us." "Let me speak to my friend at the consulate," Varian said. "Ask him to start a file for you at least. If you do decide to leave, it might take months." Chagall shook his head. My apologies, Monsieur Fry. I'm sorry you had to come all this way in vain. But perhaps you'd like to have a look at the studio before you go. If you've finished, that is. Varian couldn't speak. He could scarcely believe that a person of Chagall's intelligence, a person of his experience, could fail to see what he himself saw clearly. Chagall rose and crossed the courtyard to a set of 10-foot-high blue doors, and Varian got to his feet. He nodded his thanks to Bella, then followed Chagall across the broken paving stones. Beyond the blue doors was a long, high-ceilinged room with a wall of windows, the former refectory of the girls' school. Canvases lay about everywhere, and for long minutes Varian walked among them in silence. As well as he knew the painter's work, he had never seen it like this, in its pupal state, damp and mutable, smelling of turpentine, raw wood, wet clay. From the canvases rose ghost-like images, a grave-eyed Madonna hovering above a shadowed town, serenaded by cows and angels, crucified Christ wrapped in a prayer shawl, his head encircled by grieving sages, a woman kneeling beside a river, pressing a baby to her chest, clusters of red and white flowers rising like flames. It's no small matter to cross an ocean, Chagall said. More can be lost than canvas and paint. An artist must bear witness, Monsieur Fry. He cannot turn away, even if he wishes to. And that's where I'll stop. The scene that I've just read to you, it was part of what really made me excited about this project. The idea that this ordinary American, a Harvard-educated journalist, Varian Fry, decided to take it upon himself to go to France in 1940, armed only with a list of 200 names and about $300, or $3,000 rather, and try to find these imperiled artists who had fled to the south of France after the Nazi occupation and were now trying to find a way to get out of the country. As is still true for refugees trying to get into this country, it was incredibly hard for people to get visas. There were a lot of barriers in place, and operating even more powerfully then was the force of anti-Semitism, which was just as strong in this country as it had perhaps ever been at a time when the Jews of Europe were deeply imperiled. And so what I found so incredible about this story was that pretty early on in the process, Varian recognized his own limitations. He really understood just how crippled he was by his inexperience and by his lack of knowledge of how the intricacies of the visa process operated and by what people had to go through in order to assemble all of the necessary materials to get out of France at the time. So he assembled a group of more experienced people who had worked in the Préfecture de Police in Paris, people who had experience with helping émigrés, people who knew how to locate those who were fleeing from the Nazis. And together they formed a group that then ended up working for more than a year to get more than 2,000 writers and artists out of France. Now, the question in my mind was, as a novelist, what is it that was animating this process for Varian, emotionally speaking? What was going on in his heart while all of this was going on outside of him? And one thing that I found really interesting and complicated was that he was separated from his wife for an extended period for the first time since his marriage, which was especially problematic for him because he was gay and he had not really been able to ever live openly as a gay person. Nor was he able to do so in France, but he did have more freedom to explore relationships than he would have had if he had been home in New York. And so that was one thing that was going on in his life at the time. And then I think another thing that was happening was a kind of reckoning with the life he had led up to that moment, which was one that was kind of more passively concerned with what was going on in the world politically, as opposed to one in which he was actively engaged every day in the actual saving of human lives. And part of what he discovered was so difficult in this process was that he had to decide how his organization's resources were going to be allocated. So refugees kept showing up at his door, at his office in Marseille, trying to make a case for themselves, saying, you know, my work is important. I deserve your help. I need you to put your resources toward helping me get out of France. Um, how was he to make the determination, given the sheer number of refugees that were arriving in France, who he should actually help? And sometimes those decisions would come down to something as seemingly minor as an artist's ability to make a series of sketches of the port of Marseille on a cloudy day, or whatever fragments of a portfolio they happened to have with them at the time. So, given that he understood the injustices that the allocation of these very scant resources entailed, one of the parts of the mission that became more and more important to Varian was just to expand the scope of his organization. At first, he was really supposed to only restrict his activities to finding these 200 people on his list. But as he stayed longer in Marseille and began to understand how dire the situation was, he started to argue with the State Department to try to get more visas and to try to expand the scope of his operations so that he could offer aid to those who were perhaps not at the very highest echelons of their art already, but who were just sort of up and coming as artists, or maybe who were associated with those who were artists, like their family members or their friends. One of the stories that I find particularly striking was that of a young scholar who came to the south of France with her husband. She was not yet established as a writer or a thinker. She had just had a dissertation that Walter Benjamin found rather exceptional. And she had been recommended to Varian by various sources, but she certainly wasn't somebody who would have originally qualified for his help. He read her work, he met with her, he did decide to help her, and it turns out that that person was Hannah Arendt, and she ended up getting out of France with his help. Um, so, so this project was one that I worked on for about 10 years while I was finishing another novel that overlapped with this one in certain ways. And over the course of those 10 years, we saw the United States go through some really pretty profound political changes. The issues at the heart of this novel were not necessarily at the forefront of everyone's mind when I first started working on the book very seriously around the time of Obama's election. But let's just say that after 2016, the focus changed a little bit, and suddenly issues of immigration became quite dire. And so they continue to be, as for example, we now are trying to open our doors more to Afghan refugees and always to others who need our aid. But I continue to be struck by the courage of what Varian did, how difficult it was for him to take upon himself the responsibility to act and to place himself in a kind of personal relationship with these imperiled lives. And so I just feel like his story just continues to speak to us all and should speak to us all. And so I hope that you will learn about him. I hope you'll read about him, not just in this novel, but online. And there have been, incredible museum exhibitions of his work. And there's also going to be a TV show on Netflix. My dear friend Anna Winger is going to be adapting this book, is in the process of adapting this book for a series that's going to begin shooting in the spring, and that will come out about a year later. The working title for that project is Transatlantic. And I'm very excited about it. I'm excited to go back to Marseille and see it being filmed this spring. So I'll be excited to hear your questions at the end of this hour. And now I'm going to turn it over to our next set of guests.
Thank you, Julie. That was great. And I'll just replace no, I'm going to replace it with Carolyn's spotlight. While I'm doing that, though, I saw recently a Facebook post from one of our other authors that appeared here a few months ago, Sally Koslow. She was, and she posted something about Varian Fry and her thanks to all the writers and novelists who she's had the opportunity to learn from about him. So I assume she was talking about you as one of them. She also writes historical novels. Okay, please stop. All right, and now while I'm getting you to unmute, one sec. Oh, you're unmuted. Okay. Let me introduce you though. Okay. Carolyn Goldberg Igra is a freelance writer, an art historian, a triathlete, and a mother. She lives in Tel Aviv, Israel, but maintains a clear footprint in her native Philadelphia. She's published numerous art historical articles, several exhibition catalogs, and a book on J.D. Kurzenbaum, chosen as one of Slate Magazine's best books that year. Her nonfiction has been featured in several online journals, including Away Journal, Mother's Always Right, Pandemic Journal, and another Chicago magazine. Her first novel, Count to 1,000, was published in 2018. Her second, From Where I Stand, was published last week, also by Kohler Publishing. So take it away, Carolyn.
Okay, hello, can you hear me? Someone wave, okay, thank you. So first of all, it's just really an honor to follow Julie Orringer, because I just love The Invisible Bridge. I'm a real fan. It's really amazing, and I'm looking forward to reading the Flight Portfolio. I haven't had an opportunity to yet. I'm going to do, my book is totally different. The kind of writing I do is completely different, so it's a sharp turn. I wanted to just start with a little bit more information about myself, because it has a lot to do with how I write and the way I go about writing. As Julie nicely introduced me, thank you, Julie, so much. I was born and bred in Philadelphia. I was educated in the States, and I arrived in Israel almost 30 years ago. I'm getting to the anniversary soon, with an art history doctorate in hand, and I immediately started teaching at both Hebrew University and Haifa University. Along the way, I started curating. I was fortunate enough to fall on a very interesting project and publish a book about a Holocaust artist named Kirschenbaum, who had fallen between the cracks. And I had basically revived his work, which was very exciting. All of the work that I did for the first 15 years of my so-called professional career was research-oriented, research-based, and basically scientific. I loved writing as a child, but I never thought of writing anything that wasn't based on reality. Everything changed around 2005, 2008. I'm not sure exactly when, with the advent of blogging. I mean, blogging really changed my life. I adored reading other people's blogs, and the kind of blogs I was most attracted to were the ones that were written by Americans living abroad. That was the most interesting to me, because I was an American living abroad, and I thought it was really interesting to hear about what other people were going through. I had a lot of thoughts in my head, and I was just really excited to think of a new venue, a new way to voice what I was experiencing, which was a combination of good and bad, quite a few difficulties. So I started a blog myself called Stuck in the Middle, because that's exactly how I felt. And I blogged a lot. I wrote a lot of short pieces, nonfiction, what would now be called flash nonfiction, but I don't think we used the word flash at the time. After blogging for a few years about things that I was experiencing, things that friends of mine were experiencing, just kind of understanding that it was a communal experience, I realized I had a story to tell, and I didn't know what to do with that. I had never written a real story, at least not since grade school. And I realized it could be a book. So I started taking writing classes. I took quite a few writing classes because although I knew very well how to write an article and I'd written a book already and I had a book published, I had no idea how to write a real story, a fiction story. So these characters, I thought, I mean, one thing I've really enjoyed in these panels that Julie has organized is authors talking about how they came about writing and how they go about writing. So I did want to go into that a little bit. I had to learn, for example, how to develop my characters, how to build suspense, how to get the reader to turn the page, how to compel them to turn the page. And I had to develop, I had to learn how to build a backbone to a novel. Because as I said, it was something I had never gotten the chance to develop. I had a few wonderful teachers and I jumped right in and I published a book called Count to 1,000 in 2018. It was a work of fiction, but it was informed by experiences of many of the, especially the women around me in Israel. By that time, I was pretty much writing full time. I joined a lot of writing groups. I adored it. I wrote about all sorts of subjects, but very short form. Again, I returned to short form pieces. And one subject that kept on poking up and kind of, you know, saying, here I am, don't forget about me, was the subject of mothers and daughters. And I just thought this was a minefield and I really shouldn't touch this. I'm not going to touch it. I'll just do short forms in my writing groups. I'm not going to do anything more with mothers and daughters. But I just couldn't, you know, shove it away. I couldn't get rid of this little demon sitting on my side, the little green guy saying, come on, you want to do it. You want to write about mothers and daughters. So, I mean, to be honest, I'd been fascinated by mothers since I was a child. I was in love with my own mother as a child. And in addition, I just had this, I was an avid reader. I had a whole list of mothers who I just thought were the be all and end all, you know, Mama Duckling, Ma from Little House on the Prairie, Marmee, Moomin Mama. I had a whole long list. And of course, I also came across all the mothers that I thought were the worst I'd ever heard of, mothers that in a million years I didn't want to have anything to do with. Matilda's mom, Kevin's mom, Portnoy's mom. And of course, the you know, the creme de la creme, the peak of all the horrible mothers, Joan Crawford. I mean, I can't remember the name of a movie I've seen yesterday, perhaps, but I clearly remember vivid scenes from Christina Crawford's memoir. Somewhere around my tweens, my early teens, I realized that there was another element. It wasn't just about the mother, that I was the daughter. And that was interesting. Like I'd never thought, wait, it's not just about mothers. It's not just about daughters. It's about a relationship. And I think that's when it became very personal to me. I mean, I think the number one, someone wrote in the chat here, what kind of books do you read? I read a lot of mother-daughter lit, a lot of it. In fact, I have developed a long list, and if anyone wants any recommendations, I can give them a lot. I am fascinated by mother-daughter relationships. It is always personal because it can't not be. But I started when I was a teenager, started considering my own relationship with my mother and then her relationship with her mother. And of course, at some point, say 15 years later, everything shifted because I became a mother. And all of a sudden, I realized that I'd stepped into these golden shoes as the mom, and it demanded a complete reassessment. All of a sudden, the perspective was totally different. And then I began to think, as my own daughter was growing up, what is she thinking of this? And am I being the same mother that my mother was to me? And am I doing a good job? Am I not doing a good job? I watched my mother become a grandmother, which is it just seems like the best job ever. You know, you have fun with the kids and pass them back. And I realized it was all about perspective. So I started writing about these in short pieces. And eventually I couldn't avoid that little green monster sitting on my shoulder, and I came up with the idea, I've got to do a book. I had no idea what to start with, but I knew that it needed to be a triangle, a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. This is the book that has emerged from Where I Stand, which was just published 5 days ago. And I love the idea of the triangle because it is a fixed form, and the three people cannot escape. They're always connected. They don't want to, I mean, they just, it's a permanent part of their lives that they belong to one another. They are part of each other's lives. At the same time, in an equilateral triangle, they're pulling away. And they're constantly pulling to the end as far as they can get, in a way. In an equal way. The grandmother has her reasons for pulling back. The mother has her reasons, the daughter has hers. They're all kind of, I think that what I've discovered from all of my research, shall we say, is that mothers cast a heavy shadow, and it's incumbent upon, and it's natural that daughters want to stretch away, or even grandparents, that their grandmother, that they want to pull away and find their own light and, get out from under that shadow. So that was the start of From Where I Stand. Since, as I said, I still didn't know how to write the story. I had no idea what I was going to write about. I had to create a story from nothing, whereas Julie just spoke about having this very concrete historical figure and history to rely upon, which is so interesting. I brewed up a story from nothing, just a feeling and just a fascination, a personal fascination, even obsession, with a little bit of research from reading other books and getting other ideas and things like that. But I really, it was kind of a bit of hocus pocus just to get it moving. But the first thing that I did, and this is where I'm going to leave you with this before I do a little reading, is that I realized if it's a triangle and if the characters are pulling away, I have to get them away from each other. I actually have to physically remove the characters from one another. Maybe even say that they're running away as far as they could get before I bring them back together. So what I did was I decided this book wasn't going to be in Israel because we don't have enough physical space to get away from one another here. We're really just kind of tied together geographically. And I put it in America. I placed the whole, I situated the book in the story in America. And I started in the East Coast because that's what I know best. And then I had the mother move as far as she could go, not California, but she moves up to the Great Plains. And then I realized I don't want her to go back. I have to bring another cat, one of the other 3 points of the triangle has to move back eventually, and to close the story and to try to bring these characters that are pulling apart constantly to discover their own significance in life. They are eventually going to also have to discover one another again. So I hope that you will read the book, because I think I didn't want to give away too much. The book is told from points of view. The different chapters are different points of view. I don't want to tell you how many there are, how many voices there are, because that would just be spoiler. But the first chapter, I'm just going to start reading a little bit from the very first chapter, is the mother, Elizabeth. Okay. One more set of headlights. They swung my way, blinding me with their yellow glow, but I didn't blink, and they moved away, disappearing down the street. It wasn't Belle, not yet. It was so late. She was angry with me. She'd been angry for weeks. It had all started with that boy, that Tom, with the moment I'd walked into her room and found them half naked in bed, on the way to trouble, if not already there. I was shocked. I hadn't even known Belle was home, just wanted to collect her laundry. I wasn't expecting the trail of unfamiliar clothing on the floor by the door, the discarded boots, several sizes too large to be hers, the appearance of my daughter in bed with the boy mid-embrace. She was only 16. Get up, get dressed, get out. I squealed like an animal being butchered. The boy jumped up, throwing on clothing. Belle disappeared under the sheets. Next thing I knew, he was out the window, not the door, because then he would have had to pass me. Belle jerked out of bed, her eyes blazing. How could you? What's the matter with you? Belle. I stood in the doorway, watching as she pulled on clothes and then hopped out the window as well, leaving me standing there. Left alone, I made my way between the trail of abandoned clothing and sat on the edge of the bed. What is the matter with me? How could I have reacted in such a fashion when I knew full well what it felt like? The first time love meant something more than a kiss. My own mother took my adolescence hard. She was ill-equipped to deal with a burgeoning young woman. When my camp boyfriend suggested making the long trip down the Bronx Highway from Riverdale on his new 10-speed Schwinn, she threw a tizzy fit, clearly threatened by the reasons a boy might make such an effort, the rewards that might consequently be expected. Hollering while Tom scrambled for his clothes, I forgot the significance of those firsts, how I'd buzzed in anticipation before John's arrival, eager to show off my new lava lamp, the deep purple poster over my bed, and the ultra-cool look I'd achieved by changing all the light bulbs to blue. I was more than ready for a second round of the summertime love we'd shared the previous summer at camp, and couldn't begin to understand the draconian rules my mother quickly imposed in an effort to thwart any intimacy. Way back when, I swore I'd never recreate the atmosphere of forbidden, knowing it served no purpose. It was impossible to understand how decades later, having swapped roles, now the worried mother, I'd become the adjudicator and the hard ass. Forgetting my own experience, I'd become my mother's daughter, putting principles ahead at any cost. I waited what seemed like forever, and still, Belle didn't come home. When she finally did, my worries had morphed into anger. How could you? You know how much I worry. Go straight up to bed. I changed my mind. I couldn't just let this pass. No. Wait right there. We need to talk. Her heavy movements, those skinny limbs, nothing like their usual graceful selves, banged up against the door jamb, the hall table, even the banister. I can't believe you're drunk. We've talked about this. I've told you a million times. It only leads to trouble, bad decisions, mark my words. She was barely listening. I could tell by the odd angle of her head, by the way she was pulling on at her ponytail and staring at her legs as if willing them to not buckle, to keep her upright just a few more minutes until she could collapse in bed. That's when I saw the envelope. Steadying herself the best she could, Belle reached into the bag draped loosely over one shoulder and pulled it out. I tried to figure out the odd mixture of happiness and expectation on her face. It wasn't what I'd expected. I was celebrating. She handed it to me. I read, "Congratulations." Completely taken aback, I looked up into her eyes. Although dulled by the alcohol, they glistened with excitement. The words that followed swam before me. This letter serves to inform admission, program. My heart galloped. Juilliard. When did she apply to Juilliard? Why didn't I know? Belle. I paused, fumbling to find the words. I don't understand. I mean, wow, but my head began to pound. My worry and anger replaced with a whirlpool of thoughts. Juilliard was in New York City. We lived in Grand Forks, North Dakota. The distance between the 2 points was too great to calculate, and that was only the beginning. There were vast cultural differences between the frenetic urban life she'd find there and the sleepy kind we lived tucked away in the Great Plains. How will Belle ever negotiate them? How can she get along without me there beside her? On top of all this was the bold reality that if Belle left home, left me, there'd be no time to repair our seriously tattered relationship. So that's just a little tidbit, and I hope that some of you will want to read more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. I'm gonna add 2 spotlights now. Okay. So now for our next book, we have 2 translators. Jordan Finkin is the rare book and manuscript librarian at the Cloud Library of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He's the author of several scholarly monographs, as well as the founder and director of Natus Press, a nonprofit publisher of Yiddish literature and English translation. And Allison Schachter is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and English at Vanderbilt University and the Chair of the Jewish Studies Department. She is the author of Diasporic Modernisms, Hebrew and Yiddish Literature in the 20th Century, and most recently, Jewish Women Writing Modernity, 1919 to 1939, just out with Northwestern University Press. So I will leave it to you two to tell us about From the Jewish Provinces. Jordan, can you start? Are you starting? Or Allison, one of you starting?
Allison, are you? Okay, well, okay, I think Allison's, Allison will be back presently. So, well, I'm flat-footed because Allison was preparing this piece of the puzzle. We've translated a group of short stories from the single collection. Oh, okay, Allison is back.
All right, let me see if I need to unmute her. One sec. Yep.
Of course, my internet would cut out literally at the moment when I was going to speak. But thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this conversation, and it's really a privilege. There's both the writers today and all of the writers who've participated. It's such an incredible group, and it's really a pleasure to bring Fradl Shtok's voice to this group of writers and this particular group of women writers today. I'll say that I'll talk a little bit about Shtok, and then I'll pass on. He's going to read from the collection. But the translation, one of the things I think I learned, this is really, I've done some translation for my scholarly work, but that the process of translation, I see it as giving voice to another artist in a different language. And it's not just finding word for word, but it really is creating the possibilities for artistic vision in English. And it was really a wonderful experience to do it and to work collaboratively. It felt like at certain points I was really channeling this really amazing writer. So the project began from my own research. I was writing a book on gender in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And as I was doing my research, I was writing about women writers in Hebrew. And I suddenly realized that all of the women writers in Yiddish that I was thinking about were all poets. And I started to kind of scratch my head about that because, of course, I knew of a few Yiddish women prose writers, but when you think, if you know any Yiddish writers, it's likely to be Sholem Aleichem or Ayal Peretz, are all male writers. And in fact, the canon of Yiddish literature in many ways of the 20th and 21st century is a canon created in translation. And the story of the translation of Yiddish has been a story of translating men. And it's only very recently in the past 5 years that we have come to have volumes now of prose fiction by women. So as I was starting to do my own research in the early 20th century and finding women's voices, I was reading through one of the few Yiddish journals edited by women called Züchter, which was in what was then Lviv, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I came across a review of Fradl Shtok's collected stories. So this was a review written in the 1930s. She had not been heard from in a while. And I had known her as a poet. Most of the women Yiddish writers, as I mentioned, I knew as a poet. So I was really surprised. And I started reading the stories and I was like, these are incredible. And the first person that I contacted was Jordan, who'd been doing a lot of Yiddish translation. And I was like, Jordan, these stories are amazing. And I'd love to talk to you about, collaborating on translation. And in the course of those conversations, I also started to do my own research on Shtok's life. And what I discovered about her story, in some ways it's limited because in the same way that we don't have translations of women writers, we also have fewer archival records of women. Women were less likely to save their papers, their families were less likely to recognize the importance of their work, and they were less likely to be affiliated with institutions that had papers. So not surprisingly, the paper trail for Fradl Shtok was thin. And in the recorded histories, with the story in the Yiddish Encyclopedia was that she emigrated to the US in 1907. She was born in Skala, in a town at the edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right on the border with Russia. And she emigrated in 1907. She wrote some poetry to acclaim. In fact, her poems are very widely anthologized. She published a collection of short stories, and then she basically had a mental breakdown, went to an institution, and died sometime in the 1930s. And what I discovered is that that's not true. She did publish a collection of stories in 1919, but then she continued to write. In 1924, she sold a play that never got performed. And in 1927, she actually wrote a novel in English called Musicians Only. And in 1942, actually, she wrote a letter to the editor of the Forwards from LA, from the infamous Morrison Hotel, and sent along a story called The Fur Merchant, which Jordan and I also translated and included, and which was a very mature story. So it was very clear to us that she had continued to write, even though we don't have a record of her short stories. And I then found a record of her institutionalization at Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital from the 1960s, and she died in 1990. At least the grave marker seems to suggest that, alone and forgotten. So even while there were scholars interested in her, the poet Irina Klepvich has a poem dedicated to her, nobody knew that she was still alive, which I think is tragic. I also know that she was married and divorced. For a while, she worked in the garment industry, and she lived with another aspiring Yiddish woman writer, Jenny Bedrick, whose career was also cut short. So I think it's interesting to reflect on why the Yiddish literary establishment was so quick to decide that she had died. Like, why did they kill her off? This is something I think about. What was threatening about her stories? Why did she feel like she had to leave? And in my scholarly work, I write a lot about this, that in fact, we have individual stories in Hebrew literature. For instance, some of you may have heard of Devorah Baron, who also has a story of sort of personal retreat. But actually, when we look at these women writers together, we can see that there's a lot of hostility and a lot of challenges that women writers face that really push them out of the literary record. Something that was then magnified by the fact that they haven't been translated. And as somebody who also teaches, it was really important to me to bring some of these voices. When we read her stories, and Jordan is going to read from one of them, I think what was so interesting and surprising about her as a writer is that she was very much a modernist writer, influenced by European literature, writing with Schiller and Flaubert in her mind, and that she offered a very different portrait of Eastern European Jewish life than you might find in the writings of Sholem Aleichem. She has a great story called The First Train, and instead of it being about Yiddish, a Yiddish salesman riding the rails, it's about a young woman who basically, the train arrives in her town, and one day she just runs away to free herself from her family. There's lots of stories about young women's sexual and erotic awakenings, desires for non-Jewish men, struggles with the norms of community, the ways in which women push against those norms. There's stories about women with disabilities, and some of those stories are set, the majority of stories are set in Eastern Europe, and some are set in New York. There's some really interesting New York stories. The New York stories are different than the European stories, but I think that what I can say about Shtok is she's a really unique voice in Yiddish literary history, and we translated her because we hoped to find a way to bring her back to a literary community of readers, and to find the readers who she was not able to find in her lifetime. And that was sort of our goal. And there were some challenges in translating her work. We had to find, she had a really interesting techniques for portraying the internal worlds of her characters. And so sometimes, her narrators move in and out of her characters' minds, and it can be disorienting. So it was really fun to sort of figure out how to bring that artistic technique into English. And also there's a lot of play with German literature and culture because she was from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so we also sort of played with that, even some of the names of coins, which abounded in the text. And also to figure out the religious context. There's a lot of the Hasidic world. It's not a a world of observance, but there's a vocabulary that we also had to bring to an English reader. And so I hope I'll pass the torch on to Jordan, but I hope you'll find her stories and come to see, her artistic brilliance, which was really our aim in translating her.
Yes, and thank you, Julie, for organizing this, and for everyone who's speaking and listening. No, just to echo Allison, it really was a delight to discover this Fradl Shtok, and it really the sophisticated, multi-leveled portrayal of inner lives, the inner world of these characters is really remarkable. I mean, it stands against almost any other Yiddish writer in as I say, sophistication and complexity, and really careful modulation of voice, especially. I'm going to read just from this is a story called Shorn Hair. Now, this is the story of Shandel, a young bride of an old widower. She had been married off to an old widower who died 3 months after their wedding, leaving her to live with her poor brothers, eking out a living from sewing, at which she was quite proficient. So she became, in effect, the breadwinner in this little household. As per Jewish or that Jewish tradition, a new bride was supposed to shave her childhood braids, which she did, and wear a wig. The end of this story, which is the portion I'm going to read, finds Shandel pondering the implications of that shearing as her hair grows back in. When she was by herself again, she could feel the depths of her misfortune. Oh, if only I could take those years back, those youthful years. Old age gives you nothing but miseries. Miseries make you old and gray before your time, already 30 before you know it. What's the use when you can't get those years back? When you can't be like you were, never exactly like you were? Can it be different? Perhaps even better? Better, not for the sake of others, but for your own sake. You can be calm within, tranquil, joyful, not brooding. Only then you'll want to become more and more dignified. But when you're dignified, you feel as if you're always walking around in a neat new suit of clothes you're afraid to sully. In the gleaming little house stood a large mirror that Shandel polished with her dexterous hands until it sparkled like pure water. When she looked in the mirror, she saw yet another gleaming little house, another proper wife polishing another mirror. And that wife was looking at her wig, and her heart was aching that her hair had been shorn so young, her years shorn away. On the little varnished table stood some glassware. A pair of Mayalika plates rested on a green stand, and a blue dish gleamed on the wall. There was a Turkish blanket lying on the bed, an expensive dress sewn by Moshe the tailor hanging in the wardrobe. Once her hair had grown longer, she started surreptitiously plucking a couple of strands at a time and spinning and twining them into her wig. The first time she went out into the street, her heart nearly burst lest someone see. The next week, she took a little more hair. Her heart likewise pounded. In this way, little by little, she took more and more hair. With her heart pounding and her body trembling, she waited to see if anyone would notice. Each time she appeared this way, a daring new joy grew within her. She hoped that it would get better and better still. Once, after Passover, the sun shone into her gleaming little house with such devotion that tears of joy welled up in her eyes. She looked out the bright window and rejoiced for no reason. That same day, she pulled out all of the hair from the front of her head and wove it into her wig. With a giddy heart, she went to Esther's. On the way, she met Ichemeyer's wife, who took one look at her and clapped her hands. "Oh, good Lord, walking around in your own hair?" Shandel stood there, not knowing what to say. Her heart beat like a bandit's. When she saw how terrified Shandel was, Itchenmeyer's wife redoubled her fury. How can this be? A Jewish woman and the daughter of a pious mother to boot? She kept hurling fire and brimstone. Shandel walked back home crying. The day was so bright, which only caused her more pain.
Thank you. That was great. That was great. I'm gonna add more spotlights. Everyone can put some questions in the chat box if you haven't. I know there are a few. I'll get to them in a second. I'll add myself too. Why not? And I love that line that you just read. Already 30 before you know it. Okay, wait. Let me unmute Julie and Carolyn. And I just read the from the Jewish provinces last weekend, so the stories are fresh in my mind, and it was also very eye-opening to me, because maybe it's just my failure of imagination, but when I think about Eastern Europe and my relatives who came from there, I just see them in like kind of black and white pictures, and it's not you don't think about like they had sensual, erotic feelings and things like that, and I was like, oh, okay, and like, right, obviously, but it was great to read those stories and be reacquainted. So, okay, I know there were some. Oh, and while I'm looking at the chat, also just comment on something Carolyn said about that you were attracted to this topic of mothers and daughters. You kept. And for all the writers that are listening in on this call, that was some of the best writing advice I ever heard from Anne Napolitano. I was at a one-story conference, and she said, pay attention to your inner magnet. Like, what are the things that like stick to you that you can't, that you're just obsessed with, and for whatever reason you just find yourself drawn to, and that's what you should write about. So I guess that's one of your inner magnets, is the mothers and daughters. Okay, so let me just scroll back up. I know there was a question earlier about, yes, who is your favorite author? What are you reading now? This is for all of you. So who wants to start?
Well, I can just start and say that I just finished reading Katie Kitamura's Intimacies and really loved it. And that's just been on my mind a lot lately. And it is actually about translation too. So, but that's just what I read recently.
Yeah, I read Lauren Groff's The Matrix just the other day, and that's funny. These issues are all coming up.
I just have been going back to some Chekhov stories. I just reread Chekhov's story, The Black Monk, which I found really wonderful in its exploration of the sometimes fine line between genius and madness, and whether how we imagine ourselves to be bears upon how others see us, and how does it determine what we make of our lives in the world. So I just, the patience of that story and its unbelievable attention to natural detail was really moving to me.
I'm reading Alice Zepitero. She's French. Her book, The Art of Losing, which is a 3-generation saga, family saga, but it starts with the granddaughter basically trying to recover the story of her grandfather in Algeria. So it gives a rather comprehensive history of the Algerian fight for independence, which is extremely interesting. I knew nothing at all about it. And again, I got to it because I like family sagas, and I like, I'm very interested, as I said, in just seeing how one generation views the next. And it's actually wonderful. It's very hard to put it down. So I recommend it.
I just finished this morning West with Giraffes, which is a fun read. So there were some other questions here. Let me just scroll back up. I think this is a question for Julie. Is your book written? Your book is written in English, obviously. Is it published in English and French? And also someone else had another question, if there's if you have discussion, like reader's guide questions in your book, for your book.
this particular book was written in English and has not yet been translated into French, but hopefully it will be within the next year or so. My previous two books were translated into French.
And Carolyn, there's a question for you. Can we get the book directly from you in Tel Aviv? From someone here in Modiin?
Yes, because it is hard to get the books here from America. Yes, I have ordered, I've just ordered another box and they should be in about a week or two. Anyone that's interested should just contact me directly. You can find me on every social media, unfortunately, probably Facebook is easiest. So,
Well, I'm sending out the email tomorrow with all the.
oh, right. Okay,
Yeah,
that's great.
Okay. And Jan Rice is asking you, Julie. First, I read of Barry and Fry was what Dara Horn wrote in People Love Dead Jews. Is that how he appears in your book, Julie, as a misfit?
Well, it's a really great question. I think that he was a misfit in the sense that he always resisted authority. He was somebody who protested injustice from a very early age. He ran afoul of the administration at Harvard and was kicked out and almost not allowed to graduate, but managed to get some friends of his to help argue his way back in. And even when he was running this organization, the Emergency Rescue Committee in Marseille, he often found himself in opposition not only to the French government and the United States government, but also to the administrators of the organization back in the States who wanted it to hew a little bit more closely to its original mission. And so I think he did define himself as a person who was not afraid to resist authority when he found that it was in the wrong. And that made his later life, I think, sometimes a bit problematic, because I think he had trouble figuring out how to live kind of an ordinary life once he had come back to the States. But on the other hand, I also feel like he was also somebody who knew how to argue successfully for what he wanted, which was part of why his organization succeeded in the way it did. He could sort of talk to anyone. He could sort of find his way into any social situation and figure out how to turn it to his advantage. So if he was a misfit, he was also one who knew how to navigate the channels of authority and turn them toward what he believed to be good.
This is a question for Jordan and Allison. Who would have been the readers of Yiddish books written by women?
Oh God, this is ringing. Hold on. Of course, my mother is calling. So that's a great question. You know, one of the reasons why women were so widely published in the Yiddish press is because people were really interested in reading about women and women's lives. And that included men and women in a society that had been traditionally sex segregated. You know, part of the early 20th century is this moment where all of those norms kind of like go to the wayside. So men and women are incredibly curious about women's lives, and women's stories sold papers.
And there was no dearth of women. That's the point. There's no dearth of women writers, and there's no dearth of readership for the writers. It's that they couldn't get past the journal stage into volumes, into published, into book form, into review form, into the canon, as it were. There was a sort of a stop there, which is what Allison, part of what Allison's book really unpacks, the reasons for that and how that worked.
Yeah, and some of that's still true, as you know, you all probably know that, you know, it's harder for women to get books reviewed, right? And the New York Times had to work really hard to include women in the book review, or that there's still these biases that shape the ways in which women writers even today can achieve success.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a follow-up question from someone else for you too. Do you think there's an audience amongst Orthodox women for your book? And if there has been, what kind of feedback has the book received?
I've given it to a few Orthodox Jewish women. I haven't gotten any feedback yet. I think there could be. I mean, I think anybody that's interested in Eastern European Jewish life would be interested, but I don't know that I'm not sure how to market it to that. If anybody has suggestions, I'd be happy to hear it. Any thoughts, Jordan?
Not on that particular point. No, don't know.
So I don't see any other questions from the audience, but do you all have questions for each other, or if anyone wants to think about more questions, we have a few more minutes. I guess I'll ask a question about the research. Julie, I'm sure you had to do a gigantic amount of research for your book, and Allison sounds like as the two of you had to do research to uncover, more about Fradl Shtok's life. Carolyn, you mentioned just a little bit of research, but how do you approach the research process when you're coming to your writing or translating?
Yeah, this was a book that originated from other research. Varian's own memoirs called Surrender on Demand, which is the sort of colloquial name for a particular clause in the Franco-German armistice that requires the surrender on demand of any German national to the authorities within France. I just Googled that phrase when I was researching another subject in The Invisible Bridge, my previous book, and up came his memoir, which I then read, and that was the first I had learned of his work in France. And I was just astonished that at that point in my life, I mean, I was more than 30 years old, I was so surprised that I hadn't yet heard about him, that I didn't know of the existence of this incredible life-saving mission. And so, yeah, the research ended up taking many years after that. I did some of it at the New York Public Library. I did some of it at Harvard, where he was a student. When I was at the Radcliffe Institute, all of his student records were just unsealed. And so I went in and I could read his college application and the letters that his dean was writing to his father and vice versa. I could find out where he lived at Harvard. My research assistant happened to know somebody who lived in the dorm where he had once lived. So I actually went to the dorm room that he had lived in when he was at Harvard. And I went to Marseille, of course, and spent some time there just getting to know the town and looking for the traces of the 1940s in present-day Marseille, which are not too hard to find. So yeah, I would say that the research really, there was an almost bottomless fountain of sources that I found that I kept returning to and refilling from throughout the course of the 10 years of writing this book.
Fun. Sounds like great fun to me. All that.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just jump in and say that I love archives, and you never know when you dive into an archive, you never know what you're going to find, and it's exciting. And I just recommend anybody walk into an archive with no clue what you're looking at, find something. But what was interesting for me about researching Shtok was actually relying on the way that I got a lot of information about her was through records that are now available on ancestry.com, federal records, immigration, marriage, and death certificates. And one of the things that is a source of fascination and frustration for me is that I tried to get her psychiatric records from Rockland State because I wanted to know if she'd written stories there or what we could find out about it. And you need to have a family member a relative, and I actually tracked down some relatives, but I couldn't get anybody. In the end, it was harder to get someone to actually request those records. And the idea that they're out there, that there's this record of her life and experience that we can't access, while I appreciate why, it's kind of haunting to me. So but there's a lot of really interesting information out there, and there were some surprising things, like discovering that she lived with this woman who another writer wrote about, who it turns out was a Yiddish writer and who was her witness. There, just these details that we just couldn't have found otherwise.
And research-wise, I mean, Allison and I are both, scholars of Yiddish literature, but the process of effectively researching for translation purposes is just reading the hell out of those stories. I mean, reading and rereading and rereading and not just unpacking, but almost by syllable. In Yiddish, you call it griblinzich, just getting your fingers exceedingly dirty in the nuts and bolts of the text. I'd never done it that intensively, and it was remarkably rewarding, but also exhausting. Yeah.
I just want to add that I mean, my book, unlike everyone else's books here, was not based on anything archival. Although I spent many years in archives and still do art history research, and I have to say that when you come to writing fiction, you really have to do just as much research, but you have to dig into your creativity. There's a question amongst the chats from my mother, which I want to address, because she said, should the mother be nervous about reading my book?
Oh, that's your mother.
And it has to do, that's my mother. And I'm so happy she's here. And actually this has to do with the research, because yes and no, because basically, no, it has nothing to do with her or with me or anybody. On the other hand, fiction is always informed by life. It does not necessarily my life, but it's informed by life. So just as, as an art historian, when I would dig in and take a look and because I mostly dealt with the visual side, the visual proof, that you find everything you need right in front of you. It's the same thing with fiction. Even though you're creating concepts, you have to dig them from somewhere, which is why I was talking a little bit about all my sources, but it's, and I do want to cite the art historian Anita Bruckner, who, if you've never read any of her fiction, she segged from art history to fiction really nicely, and she's kind of an inspiration for me.
Yeah, I love the research part. It kind of, I feel like you get just such amazing details that give your work authenticity by including those details. Whether, like in my book, I have, I don't know, a scene that takes place at a press conference during the Vietnam War, and I read the transcripts from the State Department and from their press conferences. So like I took quotes that the reporters were actually asking the press secretary and used some of that in my book. It's just fun for me, that kind of stuff. So, okay, there's a few more questions. Jordan and Allison, have you contacted the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts? Sure.
I just typed in the chat. We actually received a grant in the beginning of this. We had a grant from the Book Center to support the translation, and they've been wonderful in terms of helping to get the word out about the book in the U.S. primarily.
Okay. And Pess, you were asking where could I get the book Allison is bringing to the fore? Did you mean this book from the Jewish provinces or Allison's other book? I wasn't sure about that. But all the books that we heard about tonight are available in Book Depository for those of us in Israel, which is unfortunately owned by Amazon also, but does have free shipping. Waiting for the day that Bookshop delivers to Israel. That'd be great. Okay. Anyway, I think we're going to wrap it up, but I want to thank everybody in our audience tonight and for all the great questions. And I would really like to thank especially Jordan and Allison and Carolyn and Julie for joining us for our 20th event. And I'm already planning the one for February, so stay tuned and look forward to announcing that soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night, or day wherever you are. Stay healthy, safe, and take care. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.